All right, here we are. We're we're winging it here in the studio, and we're having a great time. Good morning to you, Chesa Boudin.
Good morning. Great to be here. Thanks
Good
for
to
having
see
me
you. I
on.
haven't seen you since you were a little guy running around.
Been far too long.
You've been all over the world, it seems like.
I try to keep moving.
You know, last I had heard you were in Venezuela doing translations, and the next thing I know, I get a notice that you've got a new book coming out, and I've got it in my hand, and I got to admit that I got it yesterday. I went home last night. I stayed up till late reading it. I got up early this morning. It's really a wonderful book. I wish I had finished it. I'll do that tonight with some more insights. It's called Gringo, A Coming of Age in Latin America. And tell us a little bit about what you're trying to do with this book, Chesa.
Well, thanks so much. I'm really glad to hear you couldn't put it down, and that it's a fun read. You know, it's traveling sometimes is uncomfortable, and a lot of time I spend on chicken buses and in sweaty lines and this and that. And the idea is that the reader can experience all that firsthand without having to necessarily pick up and go to some of these places. Although I will encourage people to get out and see the world when they get the chance. And this book really is a coming of age story. It's my own personal story, trying to make sense of my life and my role in the world as a U.S. citizen, in countries that have many less opportunities than we do, and with histories that are intertwined often with our own government's policies, but also looking at the dramatic shift to the left that the region as a whole has undergone during the last 10 years since I started traveling to Latin America.
This book sort of starts out when you were 18 in 1999, and you're in like a canoe or a little boat going across a river, and you're going through the checkpoint. I guess you're going in from Mexico into Guatemala.
Yeah.
And you're a young kid. You're looking to see what it's like down there. You feel a little out of place with your big backpack and your nice cameraman's vest and big boots and stuff. What was it like being a young guy at 18, showing up in a country that you had never been to before?
Well, ultimately it was addictive. I loved it. It was certainly a little uncomfortable, sometimes anxiety-producing. My Spanish was terrible when I first went down there, and that was my actual motivation. Was I wanted to learn Spanish. Had no idea I was going to end up writing a book 10 years later. But the discomfort and the sometimes insecurity and the sort of stimulation of being surrounded by new people and new languages and new foods was ultimately really addicting. I found it very difficult to find other places, back at home, where I could get that kind of intellectual stimulation, where I could find that many challenges on a day-to-day basis that forced me to learn and reflect on who I am and what my role is. It's really easy when you're at home here in Chicago to kind of go about your daily life without taking the time to think about all the things you do and why you do them and how you do them. But when you go to another country and people are doing things in a totally different way and have different ways of expressing themselves and of sending social signals, it really forces you to take the time to reflect in a way that I found to be very healthy.
Chesa Boudin, when you went to Guatemala, you had been a student at the lab school on the south side at the University of Chicago. And you talk about kind of a privileged situation, which was in marked contrast to what you saw in Guatemala. But you also talked about feeling a little out of place when you were down there with your backpack and stuff. And then when you came back, you were wearing Guatemalan shirts. I think I got one on in your honor today. And what was it like coming back to kids wearing Brooks Brothers shirts and whatever? And how did you feel? What was it like coming back as an 18-year-old kid who had seen a little bit of the world, a different part of the world?
Yeah, those transitions can be difficult, and I deal with them a lot. I've kept traveling since then, and so I've gotten more and more used to those transitions. But it's hard when you go off into the world and have an experience that's really profound and formative and shaping the way you understand yourself and the way you understand the world, and you come back and see people who haven't had that experience, and you got to try to explain it to them, and they want to hear about 5 minutes of it usually, or hopefully here we'll get through all 225 pages of the book. But it's definitely one of the challenges of straddling two worlds in your life, and I think it's really rewarding for me, and I try to share it with the people around me as much as possible.
When you finished up the lab school, you went off to Yale, and what was it like? What was Yale like?
I had a great time there. I mean, I was very privileged to be able to study at an institution like Yale. Phenomenal resources in terms of support for student research, student travel. The libraries are just amazing. Great professors and a really world-class collection of students from all over the globe. So I loved my time there. Obviously, it is a very privileged and elite place. And so one of the challenges for me was engaging politically and maintaining my commitment to social justice and to Latin America in particular while a student at Yale. And I did that in a number of ways. I studied Latin American history. I did my junior year abroad at the University of Chile, which is the basis for a couple chapters in this book. And I did, a lot of work with community groups in New Haven, and I continue to do now. Actually, I'm back at Yale as a law student now, so I'm continuing to stay involved with the Latino community in the New Haven area.
Well, Chile, you bring up Chile, and Chile is an important part of the book. It's an important part of our history in the Western Hemisphere and the world. And tell us about that first day you showed up at the university there to. It happened to be September 11th, and it was the anniversary of one event and the first day of another event. Tell us a little bit about that, and the contradictions that you felt, and how you deal with that today.
Well, I was studying abroad on a Rotary International Ambassadorial Scholarship at the University of Chile, and I headed off to class on the morning of September 11th, and I assumed it was going to be a regular day of classes. And when I showed up at my campus in Santiago, I found the students were protesting, and there were tires burning in the big avenue in front of campus. The police were there with water tanks and shooting Molotov cocktails, and rocks came flying by my face. And the students had organized tactics to try to keep the police out of the campus area. And I realized that they were protesting because September 11th, 1973 was when Pinochet took power in a violent, bloody military coup that overthrew the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende. And Pinochet's regime held on to power and tortured and exiled millions of Chileans on the left over the next 17 years. And I had no idea, of course, what was happening in New York and Washington at the same exact moment that I was trying to avoid the tear gas and the Molotov cocktails. I was just, in my first experience being tear gassed, I could barely come to terms with what was happening around me. And then I get a phone call from my mom here in Chicago. And I was excited to tell her what was going on around me. And, of course, she had news that was much more serious, and it turned out.
Well, you had a professor. It turns out he's a progressive, and he was, I think, your professor there. And he kind of used you as an example in the classroom to let other people know. I guess the message would be that just because you're from the imperialist power doesn't mean that you're the bad guy.
Yeah.
Tell us about that experience.
Well, he was a professor. He was a great professor, a really prolific writer and scholar. His name is Luis Vitale. He still teaches at the University of Chile, and he's a phenomenal person who's taught at universities in 6 different countries. I was very lucky to have classes of Latin American history with him. He himself was tortured by the Pinochet regime and only escaped thanks to his international networks because of his scholarly work. He then came back after the Pinochet regime was out of power to a democratic Chile and began teaching again at the Universidad de Chile, where I was. And on the day after September 11th, when the protests were over and classes were in and all the students were trying to figure out how to make sense of the shared history they now had with the United States on September 11th, the CIA-sponsored coup in 1973 and now the terrible tragedy that occurred on September 11th, 2001. And they came to class and they wanted to know what the professor thought. And he gave us a lecture that was really very profound, and which I recount in the second chapter of my new book, Gringo. And one of the things that he was trying to point out to those students, many of whom had hardline radical politics and had a very anti-imperialist and anti-U.S. government position, that it's one thing to be against the government of the United States, and one thing to recognize and denounce a history of intervention or imperialism. It's a totally different thing to interact with young American students, individual American citizens, and that was his lesson. And he did me a huge favor by creating that space for me to participate socially and politically in the campus environment. And he also educated all of us, I think, about a very important lesson, which is international solidarity.